It says, no, they have nothing to fear. I'm walled around with their vociferations. None will ever know what I am. None will ever hear me say it. I won't say it. I can't say it. I have no language but theirs. No, perhaps they'll say it, even with their language, for me alone, so as not to have lived in vain, and so as to go silent, if that is what confers the right to silence, and is unlikely. It's they who have silence in their gift. They who decide, the same old gang, among themselves, no matter, to hell with silence. I'll say what I am, so as not to have been born for nothing. I'll fix their jargon for them, then any old thing, no matter what, whatever they want, with it will, till time is done, at least with a good grace. So this was just a line. I mean, I sort of plumbed through the unnameable, which I've kind of read and then half reread and sort of gone into halfway through and read for a while before I go to sleep or something like that, which is not advisable. And I have a hard time with in a way, it's like, there's been all kinds of conjecture about what the unnameable means. Maybe it's like the description of somebody's perceptions of the point of death. To me, it always kind of, it's always very close to this sort of like internal monologue that I kind of feel that maybe we all have, but I certainly do when faced particularly with, I suppose that to me, I kind of seem to go into this kind of internal monologue whenever I'm really, really struck with like some kind of visceral reality about myself. Particularly, I think when it comes to like interactions with other people, when I'm put into a position of like, I suppose like extreme emotion or like this like level of kind of discomfort, and it's just almost like this is what thought kind of breaks down to, So maybe in that respect, I mean, I always feel like I feel very close to kind of Beckett's writing, especially more recently. But I mean, to me, it's so. I mean, they call it existentialism, and it really fucking is. And I think that it holds true, especially. For me, it's like, talk about zeitgeist. I mean, it's like really, to me, it's very germane to kind of like a contemporary atmosphere. I mean, especially with the kind of like weird sort of alienated communication apparatuses that we have today. Spaces in between, or empty space, is really important, although I know you probably would have a lot of questions about that considering how full the walls are, but that's becoming an increasingly important aspect of my work. And it's almost like a reversal of what I used to do, I think, where I used to have just like I would almost be responding to kind of like the visual rhetoric of a point of purchase display in earlier work, but now this kind of like this idea of like emptiness sometimes kind of like speaks volumes, I think. The objects are always interesting to me, and that's one of the spaces that painting still holds like an interesting place in contemporary culture for me. Like if you want to consider its use, I don't really get too much into sort of like really romanticized ideas of paintings. Although there's still paintings that I'm kind of like I feel like very spiritually connected to from like this sort of like the idea of like just feeling a connection with an object. But to me, I consider like paintings as like a space that's like, I consider images an image other than, it's a little bit different than the typical format with which we engage with information virtually, which is that sort of like rectilinear format, and there's always like a kind of like a comfort zone that I consider a comfort zone in image reception where in some respects you tend to kind of like lose or get rid of the interface, like what you're actually, like you don't look at the computer screen, or you don't look at the TV, or you don't look at the frame. So the shaped canvases have a direct relationship to a discrete attempt on my part to change that relationship slightly, so that the painting occupies a space simultaneously as an image or an illusionistic space, but also an object. And I'm hoping that like the pointing the viewer in the direction of like the object, or actually getting them to look around the edges and down the corners, you know, of some of these things will also get viewers to start to look down. Even something as stupid as just like let's look at the wall now, or like how the wall meets the floor, or maybe it's almost like to decenter viewers from the image and put them back in the space a little bit. And I think that's something that painting can do very well, and the history of sort of like shaped canvas is kind of doing that. I mean, there's obviously a long history of that. Also, for these images, I like the idea of the bottom edges. You know, this is kind of a stupid thing, but it's just like I like the notion of the horizon, kind of the space that is in pictorial terms, in terms of traditional linear perspective. That's the space, the area that would be closest to you as a viewer. I just like that idea of that to be kind of folded in, or sort of lifted up somehow. And also, I mean, it was relatively unintentional, but the kind of like the other kind of association with particularly the graphite pieces to gravestones, I thought was kind of interesting and appropriate. It was kind of like an accident, you know. It kind of made the thing, but I was like, oh shit, that kind of looks like a tombstone. There's another aspect of painting that I think is kind of interesting. And I don't think that it's funny that we're talking about painting in a way, but I do kind of consider these paintings not simply, well, I shouldn't say simply drawings. Actually, who gives a shit? They're images. Painting, drawing, whatever. It's kind of the same thing. I think that the discrepancy between those two forms is kind of funny, because they both operate on this they have like a criteria of duration, which I think is interesting to me, and I think that is maybe I go so far as to say that it's unique to painting or drawing or printmaking. The idea of like this notion of like this hand translated pictorial experience in which there's kind of like an unfolding that happens in terms of like the various layers or the way that this thing is kind of built. I mean, talking about like Frank Nietzsche as I was a few minutes ago, that's one of the most compelling aspects of his painting, is this idea of like this envelopment, this process of delineation and then, you know, repetition and then overlapping. But the idea of like being able to kind of like perceive that duration, that sort of timeline that's elapsed. You know, I think that happens also in other forms of visual media, like static visual media like photography, but it's much more difficult. You know, I'm thinking like a lot of the photographs of Sugimoto, for example, I think really, to me, have this kind of sense of unfolding potential. Because the making process for all of these things, from like the sanding of the surface up to the drawing, is like a meditative process, like I've indicated before, and I hope that in some respects that translates to someone who's looking at the image. They can kind of, I am interested in kind of setting up a sort of like a normal, fairly normal like visual rhetoric as far as like the format, the overall dimensions, but then delivering just like a slight variation to that. Like if it's too aggressive, then I think it kind of like undermines itself almost. So that's one of those, you know, I mean, I used to make a lot of work that was much more aggressively shaped, you know, and it would have like aspects sort of dangling out into space, a la like, you know, Frank Stella's shitty 80s work, where it's like, just keep adding stuff till it's good, you know. And, well, that's, honestly, I cannot figure out a concept behind that work. It's such stupid work.
Maximalism.
Yeah, it's just bullshit, you know, and then some artists do it well. Like I think like Little Hancock does really interesting things with this maximalism, and Matthew Ritchie even does. I mean, for a while he was kind of like painting himself into a corner with his like mythology that he developed, but it's kind of freed up somewhat more recently, I would argue. And there's this that sense of like that bombastic installation really works. But for these ones, I wanted a very simple repetition to them, and like, I mean, it actually just like aesthetically worked. I think they look cool to just have that slight little, you know, at the bottom. And I like them to be like starting at 0, each one is going to have the basic same proportions. And I've done a couple of things where, like on a few pieces, I have one piece, for example, that's wider. It's actually a square format. So I want to have a few alterations with the syntax, and I was thinking like even like what you were suggesting, having some that have much more aggressive shaped edges, you know, that would in a sense be some kind of non sequitur in that visual rhythm. But I still have to kind of see how I feel about that. Like, they could be pieces that I make, but then don't show with the group because they just don't conceptually jive. What I'm talking about in many respects is like all the stuff that goes through my head, like the thought process in terms of like how I'm making my choices, you know, how I'm kind of like coming to terms with which subjects are going to pick, what the texts are going to be, and all those aspects are extremely important to me. I suppose like, on a very simple level, I would love to kind of just construct an atmosphere, and I think that, I mean, I'm hoping that I'm on the right track for that, especially when these things get to be more, and potentially are more oppressive. Just in a sense like that, an atmosphere of kind of like an unsettling atmosphere, an idea of like an atmosphere that could potentially invite a questioning frame of mind on the part of the viewer, like what should I do with this? Should I possibly like, you know, start to research more? Is it interesting? You know, how do these things kind of like set up a sense of balance? I mean, ultimately, that's what I look for personally when I go to see artwork. Is I like to be given an unsolved problem that I have to kind of chew on as a viewer, rather than being given extremely overt cues in terms of like which direction I should take conceptually. Like, this is what this work is about.